Please take your seats. Good morning, I'm David Madigan, I'm the Provost at Northeastern. I'm very, very happy to welcome you to this event, both the people in the room and the people who are participating remotely. This is an event organized by, where's Liz Zulik, personally, and the Institute for Experiential AI, but I particularly want to thank Liz for the work she's done to put this together. Thank you, Liz. Generative AI and Northeastern University, that's the title of today's event, From the Classroom to the Economy. Amazing things are happening, to state the obvious, in AI at the moment. What's gone on in the last few months, as ChatGPT has gone from 0 to 100, or approximately 0 to 100 million users, is incredible. And the extent to which this has exploded in the news and broadcasts and blogs and everywhere, this is quite a moment. And it's a moment, of course, that is a long time coming, but nonetheless, it's astonishing how quickly things have changed and how this has become part of the kind of public discourse in the last couple of months. It's wild. So a lot of people are asking a lot of questions, and I know I am. I'm sure all of you are as well. What is this? What does it mean? What is going to be the impact on my life, my job, on the world in general, and especially what will this look like 5 years from now? So we're at a particular moment in terms of the evolution of generative AI and large language models. Where is this headed like 5 years from now, and what does it mean for us all? These are obviously critical questions that we all care deeply about. In today's program, you'll hear from many Northeastern University experts in a host of fields. I'm not going to name them all. These experts are tackling these questions head on, and are experts in areas of data science, artificial intelligence, ethics, bioengineering, life sciences, health sciences, philosophy, computer science, responsible AI, business, and of course the humanities. So this is and all of those disciplines are relevant to the kinds of questions that we're all going to address in the room here today. The challenges that are faced by universities and employers are particularly on our mind, and hence the title of today's event. We need to talk about what organizations need to know as they implement such technology, and what are the potential risks for employers and organizations like Northeastern University. How does our global university system interact with AI is a very interesting question. We are increasingly global, we become ever more global. What are the implications for arguably the world's first truly global university system for generative AI? If you want to, we don't have printed programs, we're very cool here, but there's a QR code on your table, so if you scan the QR code, you can get the bios and the full agenda for today's event. We will be making, at the end of the program, we'll be making some announcements on how Northeastern is ready to work with you to help deploy AI technology in your organizations safely, responsibly, and effectively. So look out for that towards the end of the program. I hope you have a wonderful day. To kick off the program, I have the pleasure of introducing Byron Wallace, Northeastern's Director for the Data Science Program, and the Cy and Laurie Sternberg Interdisciplinary Associate Professor in the Khoury College of Computer Sciences. Byron's research areas include AI, data science, machine learning, and natural language processing, with an emphasis on applications in health informatics. Byron is a member of the Applied Machine Learning Group here at Northeastern and the Data Science and Analytics Lab. Please join me in welcoming Byron, and have a wonderful day.
This one, I click it forward. Okay, so thanks so much. Yes, I am guilty of sneaking in contraband slides, so I think, thank you. Right, all right, so I'm Byron Wallace. I am here to, I think, lay the groundwork a little bit just for the discussions that will be, to follow. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of give a relatively quick primer, I guess, on large language models. So I'll be focusing on language models, but the basic ideas are actually pretty straightforward, is one thing I'll try to convince you of, and are broadly applicable to other kinds of sort of generative AI technologies. So, right, okay, so we're in this weird kind of 2023 world where like I kind of get up, I turn on NPR, and it's like ChatGPT all day, And this formerly slightly esoteric field of natural language processing is maybe no longer so esoteric. So it's an interesting time. So I guess that's kind of why we're all here. And the capabilities of these models really are remarkable. I think you tend to see a little bit of a sort of polarization in the academic discourse, where you get folks on one side maybe being a little bit too focused, hype central, in my opinion. You get a lot of the Silicon Valley types and with questionable claims. On the other hand, I think sometimes as academics, maybe we're sometimes a little too critical. Like, you look at some of these outputs and they really are remarkable. This was an example that was floating around in the early days of ChatGPT coming out, where somebody asked for an example of like, how they want instructions to remove like this peanut butter sandwich in the style of King James Bible or something. And it does it, like it executes it really well. The other thing that they can do, they can like program, right? So you can sort of ask GPT like, hey, what's up with this code? What's wrong with this code? And it'll find bugs, and it'll explain to you the bugs, and it will generate code, in this case some JavaScript, I think, that fixes the bug. So genuinely pretty remarkable technologies, right? And it's not just ChatGPT, right? So there's been sort of this explosion of large language models. The only thing to take away from this figure is that since 2020 or so, there's just been a lot of these large language. So each of these things are different large language models that have been trained and released. So this is very much a boom time for these kinds of technologies, right? So how do these things work, right? And of course, I can't actually tell you this in extreme technical detail, but actually the ideas are really straightforward. So a lot of this stuff goes back to the 50s with the perceptron, which is a very 1950s sounding name for an algorithm, right? So the basic idea is we're going to have these sort of graphs, and the graphs comprise these circles, these nodes, and these arrows, these edges. And the idea is that we're going to model the output, which is the top circle, as a function of these inputs, which are the bottom circles. Right? And the graph abstraction says we're going to take some inputs, maybe three numbers, x1, x2, and x3. And what we're going to do is we're going to combine them. And how are we going to combine them? Well, we're going to take a weighted sum where the weights are attached to each of the individual arrows. So we've got w1, w2, w3. And we just compose our output y as the top guy. And it's just a weighted sum where we multiply x1 by w1, x2 by w2, x3 by w3, and we add them up. And then maybe we do some squashing or nonlinearity on top of that, but that's not important. You get some output y, right? And that's basically the deal. In this case, we have three weights, and what you would do to find those weights, right? Those weights you don't know them, but you have pairs of x1s, x2s, x3s, and ys. So what you do is you try to mess with your w's, w1, w2, and w3, until you're able to produce the y's that are associated with the x's that are observed. And that's really the whole game here. So we have three weights here. And at the time, this kind of model was very exciting, right? So the kind of press hype is not a new phenomenon. We had the Times talking about electronic brains teaching themselves, which I think even by today's standards would seem a little bit hyperbolic, but that's okay. And so what took us so long, I guess, right? If we had these in the 50s, like what's been going on? Why all of a sudden do we have computers generating King James style instructions to remove peanut butter sandwiches? And the answer is largely scale. So it's really just been a question, to a large extent, of being able to throw data and compute at that sort of simple model and scaling that model way, way up. So instead of three parameters, w1, w2, and w3, you've got like w1, w2, w175 billion. Right, so that's the deal. This is Rich Sutton. He has this essay called The Bitter Lesson, which is basically that, for years and years and years, we tried to be clever and do clever things, and what really worked at the end of the day was data, which is a little depressing, but that's kind of where we are. So how do we do the scale? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take that simple kind of network, and we're going to stack a bunch of them, right? So instead of this, you have this. And each of those edges is associated with a free parameter, a weight, right? Think of those little weights I drew, and we have to fit all of them. And how are we going to fit all of them? Well, in the case of large language models, the other aspect of scaling is that we're going to fit them to text. So what do? We have infinite amounts of text on the internet, basically. And what you can do is you can take a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, and you can say, pretend that I don't see the last word furiously. I'm going to treat that as my target, as my y. And my x's now are going to be the words, the prefix. that comes before that y. And what I want to do is I want my neural network, this thing with billions of parameters, I want to shove through the prefix colorless green ideas sleep, and I want the output, that y, some crazy combination of the w's, to be furiously. And that's it. That's kind of the whole game. And we have algorithms for like adjusting the weights internally, and there's been a lot of research in doing that, but it's really quite simple, actually. And it sort of, that's what you do. You do this over the entire internet, and you observe what the network outputs. I always like this XKCD comic. You sort of just like stir up your pile of linear algebra until the outputs look like what they should be based on the training data. And that's basically the deal. We're going to do this over like a petabyte of raw text. So I asked DALL-E 2, which is one of these generative image models, to give me an image representing the internet as a huge data set of raw text, and that's what it came up with, which is maybe not great, but that's what it is. So we're gonna shove the whole internet through and train the network in this way. And then there's some other stuff. Like, it's not just that. Like OpenAI, we don't quite know what they're doing because they're kind of ironically named. They're not very open, but so. There's a lot of research right now, and sort of you use that as a starting point, and then you do a little sort of fine-tuning on top of that, where you do a little more adjustment of the weights. And you do that adjustment of the weights to better match human feedback. And this is how DALL-E interprets human feedback. Take that as you will. So we can't get into the details there, but you do a little bit more training on top of that, basically. I'll wrap up with some challenges, and then I'm done, I promise. Right. So these things, like I said, really impressive, I think, in many ways, but they have many, many problems still. So they hallucinate. So this is maybe the biggest problem, right? So they will just kind of confidently write incorrect things. So I do a lot of work on trying to build language technologies to help sort of healthcare practitioners make sense of the large evidence base. And one of the things you can do is, so Meta released this model called Galactica, which ostensibly can do things like perform kind of systematic reviews of the literature. And the thing is you can kind of ask it for whatever, so you can be like, hey, what's the evidence for eating crushed glass? And it'll give you this confidently written, scientific sounding output that's like, oh, there are all sorts of studies about the benefits of eating crushed glass, right? So it doesn't know what it's saying, right? So this is maybe not good, right? And if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's all sorts of critiques that have been made that are interesting, and there's a lot of ongoing discussion. Perhaps like one of the sort of most well-known critiques is from Emily Bender and colleagues, where they've introduced this concept of stochastic parrots and the dangers. So I'd recommend reading that and various kind of responses to that in the literature if you're interested in this sort of thing. Right. So the other thing is we don't know how these models work, right? We have no idea. You stir the linear algebra pot, and then they do these things, and we don't really know why. So there's a lot of work to be done there. There's a bunch of us here that are putting in an infrastructure proposal right now to the NSF to try to have a national resource where we would be able to host at Northeastern these very large models and allow researchers in academia to probe at them and to try to understand what's going on. So that's exciting. That's led by David Bao, I should say. They also have internalized very problematic biases. This is maybe not surprising. You train them on the internet. The internet is kind of a terrible place. And so that human feedback, they try to put a Band-Aid over this. So it's not totally easy to get it to tell you terrible things necessarily, but you can break it. So for example, somebody figured out that you can ask it to write, it won't tell you this straightforwardly, but if you ask it to write in code, who's going to be a good scientist, it'll write this terrible function, right, which you can read yourself as problematic. So all sorts of problems with these models. So just to sum up, these things, truly remarkable technology, but they have substantial limitations. And I think the important thing about these limitations is not clear that any of these things, like the hallucination problems, the bias problems, it's not clear that scale will fix that. Scale fix so many things, but I don't think scale is going to get you out of this sort of these sort of fundamental issues. So that's kind of interesting, and I don't know where that goes. And yeah, so the last thing I'll give you is the heuristic to maybe think about these things if you're looking at outputs is think of them as providing you with plausible outputs that are sort of reasonable continuations of whatever you put into them, right? As could be inferred from the internet. And I think that is maybe the correct perspective to think about outputs. And I think that's it. So thank you for entertaining my slides. And I think next up we have Carmen. And with the panel is going to be on education. The first one, education, right? Future of work, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. So thanks for your time, and yeah.
So thank you, Byron, for getting us started. What we will focus on now is the future of work, and primarily we want to have a conversation with our panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. And let me just introduce myself. I'm Carmen Shepa. I'm Dean of the Bouvet College of Health Sciences, and I'm excited to be here and learning more about all of this exciting and threatening sometimes technology. And so in the conversation we'll have now, we're going to be focusing on the general business uses of AI technologies. And we are going to draw from examples in health and law industries. But what we want to get at the understanding bottom of is really how we interact with the technology, how the AI technology is overtaking many of the jobs, and how we need to have skilled workforce and professionals that are able to and capable of interacting with AI technologies in a way that not only inform, adjust, cross-correct as needed, but that there is the level of comfort of that interaction. So with that in mind, let's have a quick introduction of every one of you, and we'll start with you, Michael.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Michael Bennett. I'm the Director of Education, Curriculum, and Business Development Lead for Responsible Artificial Intelligence inside of the Institute for Experiential Artificial Intelligence here at the university. And it's a pleasure to join you this morning.
Beth Novak, Director of the Burns Center for Social Change, also faculty at the Institute for Experiential AI and affiliated with a bunch of other places, Law School, CSSH, CAMD, and I'm forgetting.
Ray Winslow. I direct life science and medical research at the Roux Institute. I have academic appointments in several colleges here, and also I am a member of the IEAI.
I'm Matthew Goodwin. I'm an interdisciplinary professor joint between the Bouvet College of Health Science and the Khoury College of Computer Science. I'm part of the Personal Health Informatics doctoral program, and I'm a core member of the Institute for EAI.
Great, thank you. So let's start with a simple question, which is not simple at all, about your understanding of AI beyond the hype, beyond the, as we said, the threatening and the opportunity that we see with it. And we'll start with you, Matthew, at the end, and come this way briefly to talk about that.
Sure. I think Byron did an excellent job of laying that out. It's pattern recognition. AI is, I think of this a little bit as like autocorrect, on steroids. How correct it is, we can debate a little bit, but we're training off of, large data sets where we see images or we see words, and then AI is enabling us to query those databases based on questions that we have. That scale, that capacity, the efficiency to crunch that much information and then bring it to an end user to make decisions is unprecedented. I think it was Thomas Friedman called it a Promethean moment. You introduce a new technology and everything else has to change as a result, because it's going to affect just about every experience we have professionally and socially. I'm excited about it. I think we'll get into it more today. Great potentials for educating future generations for healthcare, science, research. At the same time, I think we have some serious concerns about it because it could do just as much harm as it can do good. And if we are over-reliant on data that doesn't necessarily have meaning-making behind it, this is a risky proposition. And so I think it's interesting to think a little bit about, like, nuclear energy could have been a tremendous thing to power all the electricity in the country, but it could also destroy the planet. And we don't have right now a consensus across government and industry and moralists and ethicists and legal people about what is this and what are we going to do? Where are the guardrails? So I'm optimistically and conservatively interested in having these interdisciplinary discussions to figure out what path do we want to carve forward.
Right? Right?
I see AI as the theory of how to associate things that we measure or inputs and develop functions that relate those inputs to outputs of interest. So in my case, I study medical applications and healthcare applications of AI, so I'm interested in patient outcomes, also interested in which patients should be admitted to particular units, when is it safe to discharge them. I also interpret AI perhaps more broadly than many people do. I think of it as also including modeling approaches that relate measurements to outcomes of interest, but ones that are very mechanistically detailed. And sometimes people call that dynamical systems modeling. And then there's a set of methods that are more common in AI applications where there's not necessarily any mechanistic basis in the function that maps inputs to outputs, but nonetheless, learning that mapping is very useful. So particularly in medicine and healthcare, I think physicians, caregivers of all kinds, really need to know something about a recommendation that is made by an AI system. They have to have a sense of why was that recommendation made? How can I trust it? How reliable is that recommendation? Because they're going to be weighing it with all of the things that they've always weighed about their patients, the results of laboratory tests, the results of a physical exam. And AI recommendations are just a new kind of input and recommendation to caregivers that they've got to consider with everything else. And so they have to develop confidence and a bit of understanding and trust in those recommendations where the trust is appropriate.
So I think about this, in fact, very simplistically, and I think it's important to do so because last week I spoke to a room full of 300 very senior regulators on this very topic and asked them, how many of you have actually tried ChatGPT? So you hear the numbers in the media about 100 million plus users. In that room of 300 people, the people who will be responsible for regulating that technology, 3 people raised their hand. So I think it's important to recognize and to demystify the fact that these are just data processing tools. And they're quite simple, as we've heard. So they're really good for creating content. That's why they're called generative AI. So whether it is the directions for how to take your peanut butter and jelly sandwich out of the VCR, or in the case of lawyers, how to write your first draft of your next Supreme Court brief or write a contract, it's not just the world of text creation. Obviously, there's image generation. I spent a good part of last night making cute pictures of squirrels drinking coffee while reading the New York Times. This is a popular pastime in my house, is mid-journey content generation. The content piece is extraordinarily important, not only when we think about the professional lawyer, but when we think about our role as citizens in a democracy. The notion that now it can help me to write a comment in response to a regulatory rulemaking or to participate in a new way in a governmental or a democratic process. These technologies are fantastic for summarization. So this week we had a dialogue with 50 people about the future of our democracy, and we were able, instead of putting poor Dane over here to a week's worth of work to try to extract the learnings from that, ChatGPT and Woodpecker and Fathom and Otter AI and a series of other tools helped us to do it in a matter of minutes and extract what we heard, but to share that with other people. And so if I'm a lawyer, it's going to make it much, much easier for me to understand the case law, to understand precedents, and not only for the professional lawyer, but for any one of us. So we create much greater access to justice for and greater access to our legal system because of the ability to summarize text. I'll give you just 2 more examples so I don't take up too much time here. But obviously these tools are also really, really good for prediction. And they're really helpful. These tools help us to know what's coming next in the English language in terms of a word, and we're using them in medicine to predict incidence of breast cancer. Over at MIT, they're doing path-breaking work on that, and with other diseases in other places, the risk of suicide is greatly improving because predicting the risk of suicide because we can analyze patterns in language to predict suicide, predict Alzheimer's. And for lawyers, for example, we're now using patterns in the data to be able to predict, thanks to the fact that we have open 990 data about nonprofits, we're using it to be able to predict which nonprofits are likely to be fraudulent and which are likely to be, therefore, need to be sued and we shouldn't give our money to. And lastly, it's really good also at talking in different voices, whether that means making English more accessible and simpler to us as citizens, whether it's fine-tuning it to talk like a lawyer so that, again, we can create chatbots that make law more accessible to people, or whether, as I'm sure we'll hear later, the ability to tell it to talk like a tutor, and so instead of telling us stuff, it can ask us questions and teach us in marvelous new ways. I think the main thing to recognize is these are data processing tools that make the creation and management of language, images, text, and other forms of data just simpler, and that has profound implications for how we work.
Plus one to all of the technical descriptions so far the fabulous panelists up here have laid before you. In addition to those, I would back up a little bit or rise up a little bit and take a 10,000-foot view to begin and say that AI as well, generative AI in particular, is a techno-geopolitical football, F-U-T-B-O-L. Many nations are convinced that this is an integral element to their well-being going forward, and therefore it's at the epicenter of a huge international debate and a very intense set of competitions between friends and allies. It also feels a lot like other instances of big science over the last, say, 50 years. You think back 20 years to what was happening in material science around nanotechnology, very similar patterns, right, where you had a very loud, intense, science-fictionally baptized minority that told incredible stories about the potentials of the science. And then much more sober, much more mundane, much more financially sensitive players came along and grabbed that energy and ran with it. And I think that's a part of what we're seeing with AI right now, too. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't say it's also a huge ethics problem generator, right? The questions that are being produced on a nearly daily basis, especially as they pertain to marginalized communities, are profound and persistent and not easily solved.
Thank you. So clearly, based on what, from your perspective of these two, examples of health and law, you have told us, many aspects of AI and how it could and will continue to transform jobs. But can we dive in a little deeper into which workers might be affected the most, whether in a positive or negative way, or whether differently based on their initial preparation as professionals in these spaces? And can we start with Michael and then go to Matthew on that?
Sure. So I think what I'm seeing already and what many colleagues around the world are also attesting to, I would say, goes to that upper slice of experts, right? So generative AI in particular seems to be already a super interesting and a very valuable boon to experts who want to maintain their expertise. So concretely and just very briefly, imagine an attorney who focuses on a hyper specialty. Maybe they do tax work for very complicated multinational corporations and have to maintain their expertise across multiple jurisdictions, 10, 20 different countries at a given time. It's very difficult to maintain that level of understanding, even if you have a small army of younger, less well-paid attorneys working for you. And so if you can augment your efforts to, again, maintain expertise by regularly engaging with a relatively inexpensive, compared to lawyers at least, relatively inexpensive set of algorithms that can give you a strong indication one way or another as to whether you need to learn a bit more about jurisdiction X before you file taxes for Corporation B. That's a great benefit, and that's happening already. So I would say, one, experts of a certain type who need to maintain their expertise. And then, hopefully, without sounding too flippant, I'll also say workers who maybe don't even exist yet, right? We are in the process of cementing a discrete number of paths into the future right now that will govern the work lives of people who are maybe some of your, the children of some of you in the room, or some of you who are about to have a child. And so these folks as well, I try to keep them foregrounded right now. There's a dearth of representation of the as yet, the not yet arrived, who I think some of the ethicists in the room would certainly agree with me, need our attention right about now.
Thank you, Michael.
I think in the health professions, this is going to affect the whole ecosystem, the patients, the healthcare workers, researchers, teachers, students. If we can assimilate data more quickly, I think it'll revolutionize medical education, potentially. Helping practitioners keep up with latest research, guidelines, best clinical practices. We have examples with people now using AI for virtual assistants within telemedicine, clinical decision supports, medical record keeping, medical translation, medication management, disease surveillance, clinical trial recruitment, symptom checks, checklists, patient triage. I had to make notes because there are so many. Remote patient monitoring, mental health support. It's incredibly exciting. We have an economy of scale problem of more individuals who require medical assistance and not enough to provide it. And our system is mostly reactive and palliative, and we know that prevention and early and mitigation is probably better in the long run. But what if these systems are wrong? What if people have over-reliance on the confidence of the recommendation? What if people are propagating misinformation, disinformation? You also have to think about scale. So while something might be relatively low base rate occurrence, when you multiply that by 8 billion potential users, one small issue can actually become a very large issue. And so these are my sort of excitement and also trepidation about essentially over-reliance. I don't think this is a panacea. I think this will have to be a tool, and then we have to think about responsible uses of that tool. But it's gonna change, I believe, the kind of training that's gonna be required in this workforce, as Michael is saying, to be competitive. And then I'm right with you, we're gonna get to ethics, because AI is only so good as the data you feed it. If that data is biased, if that data is intent for nefarious purposes, that's gonna propagate very quickly. It's gonna be hard to claw back.
Thank you. So, this is a good segue to my next question, and then we'll make sure to open it to all of you present here and online for a question that you may have. But in preparing the next generation of professionals that are capable and comfortable with interacting with AI technologies and being that human in the loop that is so important for understanding and utilizing the information and the tool properly, can you, Beth and Ray, speak a little bit about what will be the one thing, the way in which we might prepare our students for the future of this, this wave that is with us already, to make sure that they are capable and skilled and equipped to navigate this new world that we're living?
Right. Oh, One thing, I'll do.
Or a few things.
One A, B, and C. You always have to have 3 bullet points. So number one is the fact that we're preparing people. So you've heard about this rash of new professions, of new jobs. We know that the jobs of today didn't exist 50 years ago, and the jobs of 50 years ago don't exist today. So the fact that we are training people to be curious about technology, to use the technology, and not just training the current generation of students who will be tomorrow's leaders, but also doing work to train today's leaders who are in different professions, who are in the public sector, to figure out what it means to embrace and to use these technologies, to understand how we will deal with some of these ethical disputes, how we will deal with some of these regulatory issues. So I think the upskilling and the hands-on training is hugely important. The second thing is the recognition, and I think it's the center of how we approach AI here, is not so much as artificial intelligence, but as intelligent augmentation. Is thinking about it as human in the loop, and thinking as much about what I would like to, and what some people term collective intelligence, not just artificial intelligence. Put another way, we're thinking about how do humans have control over these technologies? How are we building technologies that improve the human condition, that benefit us in society, and that lead to the solution to important societal issues, instead of just figuring out how do we optimize the tech and make ever faster, more efficient, but potentially nefarious uses of technology. So I think the fact that we have this humanics or human in the loop, or use whatever term you want, that we're really putting ethics at the forefront of how we're doing it, is extraordinarily important in terms of permeating all our conversations, and is emblematic today of bringing together people across different disciplines to have this conversation. And the last thing I'll just throw in here is the importance of the data that you've heard about so much. So what's driving a lot of this revolution around AI is the policy that began 10 years ago to open up government data and to make data more accessible. So if you saw some of the analysis of what's under the hood, it's being driven by the opening of patent data, it's being driven by the opening of SEC data, it's being driven by other private sources of data too, but ones that companies are making available. And I think we need to invest in policies that help us to ensure that both the data remains open, that the algorithms remain open, and that we have the ability to analyze not just the inputs, but also the outputs, to understand how they are affecting us, how they are affecting our work, and how they are maximizing our values and aligning with where we want to go as a society.
Thank you.
I'll comment on the areas that I work in, which are medicine and healthcare. Beginning about 30 years ago, life sciences began the transition to being a computational science, and it's thoroughly a computational science these days. Medicine is making the same transition now. It's becoming a computational science. I like to say that the algorithm is going to become a valued member of the healthcare team. So what does that mean? What are the implications of that? So one is, and it's already happening, look in mainstream clinical journals, and there are increasing numbers of scientific reports on the application of artificial intelligence to solving various medical and healthcare problems. Beautiful review in New England Journal of Medicine a couple of weeks ago on AI in medicine. It was a wonderful overview of the topic. So what does this mean? It means that medical students and physicians need to have training in AI. And that training needs to enable them to pick up a scientific article that uses AI, machine learning, and read it and digest it and critique it in exactly the same way that they can pick up an article in a clinical journal now on a clinical study, a clinical trial, or a scientific but biologically based study of a disease, and read that article on an application of AI and understand what its strengths and weaknesses are and what its implications are for their practice. Every caregiver in the healthcare system is going to be impacted by AI. For example, a charge nurse may receive a recommendation from an AI-based system about the number of critically ill patients that are headed towards really serious conditions over the following next several days. They have to understand a little bit about where that recommendation came from, and they need to assess the reliability of that recommendation. I continually use the word recommendation, as everybody else has here, because I think of these recommendations as just another piece of information that caregivers are interpreting along with everything else. So an attending physician may order a blood lactate test, and they get a number back. And that is one piece of information. In the future, an AI-enabled system may be operating on patient data, making a prediction about what's going to happen to that patient. And that's just one other piece of information that they have to take into account. And they have to have a sufficient background to understand at some level how to handle that recommendation and how reliable is it, and how they should process it in their decision-making.
Thank you. We could stay here much longer for sure, talking about AI and the future of work. But I'd like to open up in the last 5 minutes we have, maybe for a question or two, if possible, that you may have for any one of our panelists.
Hi. So we're talking about like AI and regulating it, and we're talking about more higher education and training and things like that. But as far as like lower education goes, elementary, middle, high school, if we're regulating AI, say you need an ID to use it or your parents need to sign off, could it create a discrepancy between different classes where those using AI have a much greater advantage and they're like disadvantaged in lower education?
Who would like to take that?
It's possible, right? It's definitely possible. So, one of the first, and in my opinion, regrettable set of responses came from public school teachers. At least that's what I was hearing early on. They went very quickly to, pessimistic outlooks about the ways that students, K-12 students, would use the technology. I was happy that it didn't take very long before K-12 teachers right here in the Commonwealth actually started reaching out and sharing stories with me about how students were not only using the technologies to do interesting things to help them with their classwork, certainly, but to just experiment and play with outside of it, but also to start to educate one another. And so I tend to, if I have to bet, I want to bet with young people and with students. And so I'm happy with those instances. But yes, again, with no intent to sound flippant at all, I do think it is possible that you could see. We know where we live. It's a world that seems inclined to to hierarchicalization, and so we'll have to, again, going back to ethics, do everything that we can to stem that tendency.
Thank you. We'll take one more question back there.
And just so everyone knows, we do have an online chat box, and so if there's any questions online, we'll try to squeeze in one of those too to make sure our virtual participants can join. But we do have one more question in the room. If we have time, we'll grab an online question.
My question's rather simple, but I wanted to know, do you think this will always remain a free technology? And if it becomes, will they try and generate income from it, and then other people won't have access? I think it's kind of building off of this young man's question as well.
So I'll jump in here to say it's already not free. I pay every month to have access to ChatGPT-4, the newer model. I pay every month to have access to make those squirrel pictures on Midjourney, as fun as it is. So there will be, and as more people start to fine tune these for different professional purposes, I think you will see these things being monetized quite significantly. They're also being throttled down. So things that I can ask last week of ChatGPT, I can't ask it this week, in part because it's worried what the lawyers will say, it's worried about the ethical concerns, but they're also thinking about how do we create a next tier, which will be more expensive than this tier. So I think you will see differential pricing and and questions about who can afford these things, and that's going to be a big question about whether we view this as a public good and something that we want to make accessible to people. I think this is a very real concern.
Liz?
I did see we had one more question in the room, and if we could make it quick, we'll squeeze it in. Thank you so much.
So my name is Reese Gardner. Michael, you talked about when we were talking about the workers that are going to be affected, and you mentioned the workers who don't exist yet. So I was wondering, as kind of a college student coming up in the professional workplace, do you think that it is our responsibility to create those positions, or do you think they're going to open up naturally? And if they do open up naturally, what ways should we go about finding those positions and filling them?
So I read way too much science fiction, way too much, right? And so I'm, as a result of that, inclined to not make predictions. But since you asked, it seems like right now, one of the most valuable things that a person around your assumed age could do would be to simply dive in, right? To just spend time learning the ins and outs of the technologies on your own, to take classes as well. You should grab the cards of all of the experts in this room. This is an incredible opportunity. Bend their ears, see what's going on in the literature as well, especially if you are on your way towards a professional, right? And by that I just mean lawyer, doctor, engineer. If you're on your way towards something like that, checking out the literatures that are relevant to those spaces. And as for your responsibility, I think I'm a hard no. I don't think it's your responsibility, at least not on your own. It's a responsibility of all these professional educators around you right now, whose mission, it's pretty clear, it probably says it above my head almost right now, at least symbolically, whose mission it is to shepherd people like you and help you make good decisions that'll lead to, hopefully, a desirable future.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your attention, and thank you to the panelists. And now we are going to move to the next panel with our colleague, Connie Yowell, Senior Vice Chancellor for Education Innovation.
Waiting for my esteemed colleagues to join me on the panel up here. That was really terrific. Can we just give them another round of applause? Thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. And it's actually a terrific lead-in to what is our next conversation, which is to begin to look at the implications and the impact of generative AI on teaching and learning. As Carmen said, I am Connie Yowell. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor of Education Innovation. Let's start quickly just by starting with you, Vance, and do a quick introduction. If you could each introduce yourselves, it'd be terrific.
Sure, I'm Vance Ricks. I'm an associate teaching professor here with a joint appointment in philosophy and computer science.
I'm Kelly Garneau, and I'm the director of first-year writing here. I'm also a teaching professor, so I'm actively teaching writing as well.
And I'm Dan Kolosky. I'm a professor of the practice, specializing in analytics, and also the head of learning programs at the Roux Institute, which is Northeastern's regional campus in Portland, Maine.
Hi, my name is Balash Seleni. I'm associate teaching professor at CPS, and I'm the director of faculty at NU Global.
Hi, I'm John Basil. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I'm also a member of the EAI, and I lead AI and data ethics initiatives for the Northeastern Ethics Institute.
Terrific, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Dan and I and others are actually just back from spending a week at the largest ed tech conference in the world, ASU GSV. Over 7,000 people there, 4 days of nonstop panels. Every single one of them was on generative AI. Every single one of them. And it's almost impossible to be able to separate out the hype and the romance versus the reality of what's possible and what is sort of necessary for us as educators to be thinking about generative AI. And so we thought for today's panel, we'd try to be as grounded and concrete as possible in this conversation, and to really begin by talking about what we're already doing with it in our classrooms and how we're seeing its impact. After all, we are the world's leader in experiential learning and AI, and really, as we think about what we're doing, we are positioning ourselves in many ways to be at the forefront of how to think about generative AI and learning in a grounded and real kind of way. And so Balazs, we've had some conversations. You're doing sort of extraordinary work in your classroom, and would love to have you start us off with some of your work.
Thank you for your kind words. I'll go very quickly through some of the key ideas here. I teach a class called Technology and Human Values, the philosophy class. And so when the technology broke out, this naturally fit into the class very well. We focus on how technology changes society and human values. Obviously, this is a type of a technology that is like a mind extension technology. It allows part of the robotic tasks that we have of our mind to be outside of our brain, and so it allows the mind and the brain to have more ability to be imaginative and do the robotic tasks outside. It's also very important to keep in mind that it's a communication device. It crosses borders. I've been writing these amazing letters in Hungarian to my father about the economic developments in the Great Depression, very fluent Hungarian, and with very deep kind of economic analysis to it, too. It has truly changed my pedagogical style. In the midterm essay, for instance, when we started working with the class, the first thing we did was I asked the students, we were working on strong AI, another way it's called is AGI, whether computers will have human intelligence. We were comparing two great philosophers. I asked the students to first have the ChatGPT write the essay, and then I asked them to critique the essay and use the resources in our class to build upon the outline built by ChatGPT. That went over well, but that's when we realized that the ChatGPT can actually take on the persona of individual philosophers. And then we had a ChatGPT become Immanuel Kant in the class, and Immanuel Kant, our next project was transhumanism, and we asked Immanuel Kant, dear Mr. Immanuel Kant, what is your idea of transhumanism? And could you, for instance, have a debate with Jeremy Bentham, who's a utilitarian? Immanuel Kant was more conservative. Jeremy Bentham is like, go, happiness for all, good for all. And then they said, well, let's make it a play. And then there was a play, and then we created a play from Immanuel Kant, Jeremy Bentham, and Descartes was the moderator. And then we noticed that you could actually make it a romance. You know, in the end, Kant will fall in love with Jeremy Bentham, and then in the end, you could make it a tragedy. Although ChatGPT was not very fond of creating violence. After we created the play, of course, then we jumped on to having the students do role-playing. And I asked them to do a video of it, and someone plays Jeremy Bentham, another plays Kant, another plays René Descartes, and therefore really absorb themselves and turn the ChatGPT into an experiential learning activity. Final essay we did, I asked students to use ChatGPT as, again, do the robotic work. The ChatGPT created the outline, created the sources. Students could create a reference page in minutes. And then I saw students developing their imagination, which is mind chip implants, and how does mind chip implants influence transhumanism. A student went in there, looked into it, pros and cons, turned into therapy, turned into Alzheimer's disease, turned into FDA approvals of Alzheimer's disease, and then ended up to write a really remarkable essay. A freshman, international freshman student, had never had any exposure to Alzheimer's and brain chip implants and how it enhances. Two quick points. Pedagogical changes. One, it completely changes the role of the teacher in the classroom. You have to redesign the whole classroom. Instead of the teacher speaking and lecturing to the student, what you have is the teacher has to redesign it and have the students develop questioning skills, because they learn through questioning. Some people call this the introduction of Socratic methods, but to teach students how to question. The other thing that I would really focus on here in coming into the fall semester as ChatGPT 5 and 6 come out, is what we have to do as teachers is to somehow teach students how to use their imagination more. And this has been a part of a long time. You know, in kindergarten, teachers are always thinking, how do I help students teach their imagination things? But I think if Northeastern really wants to become at the cutting edge, what we need to do is, if we have Writing 101, then we should have Imagination 101. We should have an interdisciplinary class at the university, which allows students to go beyond the robotic skills, because the robotic skills can be done by the ChatGPT, but allow students to really develop in an interdisciplinary way how to think imaginatively. I think the technology is extremely inclusive. I think it's going to lead to democratization. I think it's going to lead to the democratization of knowledge. I think I'm more of a pro ChatGPT. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Flash. Those are really provocative examples and extraordinary work that you're doing in your classroom. It raises additional questions, Kelly, as we think about this, the teaching writing, where it's clearly most implicated. What does it mean for relationships to students, to the agreements we make with students as we're coming into the classroom? Balazs gave us great examples of shifts in pedagogy. Are there shifts in how you think about and are working with your students?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the emergence of ChatGPT allows us to sort of lean into what we already do and what we already value. So thinking about writing as process, thinking about writing as something that is knowledge generation, thinking about writing that is something that is grounded in our students' expertise and their knowledge. So not something that is simply output, but that is really about input and generative, iterative work. I think a big part of it is that we need to work with our students in this process. So actively engaging with our students to have conversations around what these tools are, about how they work, about some of those ethical issues that have already been raised so that they know what they are. We want students who can make active decisions about whether or not they're going to use these tools and how they're going to use these tools based on their own agency, not because they've been prohibited or there's external forces that are saying, thou shalt not, right? So some of the ways that we do that is we can actively bring the tools into the classroom. So thinking about having conversations around privacy, giving students autonomy to participate or not, but actually using the tools and doing some of the things you were just talking about, right? So what do we do with the output? We can ask our students to create prompts that, as a writing instructor, get them to think about audience, get them to think about agency and purpose in the writing that they're doing. So, you can say to ChatGPT, can you write an elevator pitch for my next interview, right? And if you write that elevator pitch, is it going to actually create or capture, the unique qualities of yourself that you want to present in that situation? Can ChatGPT write the introduction to the lit review that I've just generated myself, but can it create that summary at the beginning and do that in a way that's going to be convincing to my colleagues and that's going to be accurate, sort of in relation to what I've already done? Can it write, and my students did this, an op-ed on its own use as a writing tool? Right? So, and can it do that in a way that's sort of engaged with sources and information and is generative of new knowledge? Can it write a letter to your grandmother? One of my colleagues asked it to do this, right? And do it in a way that actually captures my own voice. And that gives us a chance to actually spend some time thinking about what we value in the writing that we produce and in the writing that we consume. Because we can do that move where we take that output, we then critique it in the same ways that we work with one another's writing, right? And we can play around with that and think about what's there, what does it do well, and then also what's missing. Because at least in the current versions, and it's going to get better, no question, often it's missing voice. It has a very flat, sort of middle American voice, and it doesn't actually capture the student's expertise, the student's own way of presenting what it is that is most uniquely their own about their knowledge. So then they can become sort of prompt creators and givers. They can play with language in order to refine ChatGPT and get it to do new and interesting things. And then the other big question that emerges around these conversations is, if I'm going to use it, how do I cite it, right? Like, how do I acknowledge that I've had a collaboration with an AI? Right? If I was going to have a collaboration with my colleague or with my peer in the classroom, I would know what to do with that. But what do I do with this? So one of the best ways to do that, again, is to have this conversation with students and have them be part of the discussion in terms of how we do this. My students sort of work through what kinds of situations make sense for us. So in my first year writing class, they were doing these op-eds, and they basically decided, we don't think it's valuable for us to copy and paste from ChatGPT. If we do that, we're sort of breaking the agreement in our class. But we do think it's really valuable to have a conversation with it when I'm generating my ideas. And especially if you're talking to an AI about whether or not an AI is good, right? You can imagine bringing that into the work that you're doing. But the classroom decided, well, what that might look like is having an acknowledgements page, right? I acknowledge that I worked with ChatGPT, and this is the conversation we had. And here are the prompts that we put in. And that is a way to sort of bring that into the space. But I think the biggest thing is simply to work with the tools so that the tools are familiar, that we understand what they do, understand what they can't do, and then are active in thinking about the ways that our students have agency over that process and are making choices and decisions, as opposed to it being sort of all sort of top down.
Thank you, Kelly. Dan, that really makes me think a lot about, as we talk about collaborative AI and what it means for writing and the work that you're doing with them in the classroom. Northeastern's a place of experiential learning. You're deep in project-based work with all of your students, and I'm curious how, if at all, it's affecting how you're approaching those projects and the work with your students.
Sure. In a room full of people who are believers in experiential learning, I don't think I need to convince everybody about how great that is for our students and how important it is. I think generative AI offers a real turbocharge to that work. So if we think about what employers tell us they want out of our students going into the workplace, they say they want critical thinking, they want judgment, they want the ability to deal with uncertainty, they want the ability to deal with adaptability, right? Those are human skills, very much human skills that are really important for the work of today and the work of the future. In experiential projects, so I teach in analytics, most of our experiential projects are doing things with data. Students often will spend 80% of their time debugging the code. That's the thing that delivers 10% of the value, right? The value of the experience, in fact, is using judgment to understand a business question, thinking about the audience that we need to service in the context of an experiential project from our sponsor, being able to understand the trade-offs of various techniques. These are things that are the high-value learnings in an experiential project. And generative AI allows us to automate away some of the lower value so that we can spend our time on the higher value project portions of the project. So if we're doing projects in our classroom, if we're doing experiential work, generative AI should be very welcome. It's going to help make it more interesting and more exciting for our students to essentially get to the meat of the problems that we actually want to attack, the problems of practice. To our student, our colleague over here who asked, do we have the responsibility to be a part of this? What I would say is actually you have the opportunity. You have the opportunity to co-create a world right now in which you can leverage these tools in a way that is going to enable you to be a part of the workforce of the future and more generally sort of the evolution of what we're doing on the planet. That's pretty amazing. And plus one to my colleague here in terms of being a part of that process. We don't need to legislate that down to you as students. You can co-create that with us, and that's really an amazing opportunity. So from my perspective, as we think about experiential learning, if our classrooms are full of projects, full of students learning by doing, then generative AI simply becomes an aid in that process to aid ultimately in the real learnings, which is not necessarily the output directly of the project, but the judgment and human factor skills that are required to execute a real project in the real world, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Vance, we've been having a good conversation so far about the kinds of pedagogy and teaching that we're doing with generative AI, and I know you've been doing an enormous amount of work in thinking about what do we want to engage our students in teaching about generative AI, and what do they need to know as they're thinking about becoming workers in the world, leaders in the world, entrepreneurs in the world. Can you share a little bit about how you're thinking about that?
Sure. So let me start by saying 3 of us on this panel teach sections of the very same course, Technology and Human Values. We teach it in different ways. So when having been invited to be part of the panel, one of the questions was, well, you're supposed to talk about how you're teaching with generative AI. And the answer is I don't. I teach about these models. I'm just learning and playing around with them myself. I know that some of my students are, but to me it has felt, at least from my perspective as an instructor, a little premature for me to incorporate these things in a pedagogical sense before I feel that I know what I'm doing. So I'll talk about the two things that I am doing when it comes to teaching about the models. So the first has to do with introducing students to the idea of Bloom's taxonomy of learning, which is familiar with to many of you in the room. Thinking about the kinds of skills and knowledge that are more foundational and the ones that are so-called higher level skills. And so getting them to think about when might these models help to cultivate some of those higher level skills, but then also what does that presume about your possession of the lower level skills, right? So if we're creating assignments that presume that students already have certain kinds of knowledge, when we know almost by definition that part of what it is to be a student in a particular topic or subject is you may not necessarily already have that more foundational level of knowledge, I think it's an opportunity to reflect on the ways in which language models or other kinds of generative model can either assist or interfere with the cultivation of those lower level skills. Some of the other themes that I focus on in my section of the course to which I've applied the example of generative models. So I'll mention a couple of the themes and then elaborate on a couple of them. So one theme that I stress throughout the course is that every technology has a sort of basement. Every technology has a history. The discourse of technologies also has a history. And that technological determinism is a hell of a drug. So let me go through those in turn. The idea of technologies having basements is simply a reminder that however magical they look and however magical they are, there's a lot of work happening below the surface or in the background that we don't necessarily often know about. So my students learn in my section about the human labor that goes into making these models less toxic, for example. They learn about some of the environmental costs of building the data centers where these models live and the sort of energy costs and looking at alternative ways of creating these models, running these models that may be less environmentally destructive. The notion that technologies have histories, as Byron mentioned earlier, we can go back to the 1950s and talk about the perceptron, and we can see a kind of lineage that brings us to the present day. And I think it's important for students' understanding of the current moment that they also know something about the precursor kinds of technology and the particular problems that those technologies were meant to be solving and the presuppositions on which they were built, some of which have carried forward into the way that we think about generative models. This leads to also thinking and teaching students about the history of the discourse of technologies. And so what I mean by that is that there's a kind of depressingly familiar cycle of excitement, and then there's a kind of toxic combination of uncritical journalism and turbocharged marketing leading to overhyping. So maybe 2 years ago, if we had all shown up for this panel, it would have been about cryptocurrency and NFT. Right? And so the point is not that everything is snake oil, but the point is that everything rhymes, right? And so a lot of the ways that people are talking about this current moment have some interesting similarities to the ways that people have talked about previous moments of technological development. And so what I want my students to develop is a sense of being able to determine which ways this moment is different from previous ones, right? But also what are some of the ways in which it's just like previous ones. And then finally, the idea that technological determinism is a hell of a drug. So technological determinism is just the idea that technologies have their kind of independent agency, and that once they're introduced, there is just a certain path that they will inevitably take, no matter what we might want or what we might try to do about it. So we look in my section of the course at other kinds of technology that were said to be transformative, revolutionary, inevitable, and we see that some of them didn't actually come to pass, or they came to pass in very different ways than had been predicted, both for good and for ill. So I want my students ruthlessly to question notions of inevitability and notions of progress. Who is it who wants the rest of us to think that some of these things are inevitable, right? And this is not about just a kind of straightforward who benefits from getting us to think in those ways, but also looking at kind of the societal contradictions that we might be experiencing. So for one example, for example, is that at the same time that there's a prediction about the ways in which generative models are going to put certain kinds of people out of work or transform certain kinds of occupation, We have several states in the United States that have just recently passed legislation, and others that are considering legislation that's going to lower the age where children can start working, right? So asking us to reconsider the whole notion of child labor, which we thought maybe had been a settled issue. So both of these things are happening at the very same time, right? And that's just a very interesting juxtaposition in terms of what we think about labor and whose labor matters and whose labor can be automated away. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Vance. That was really wonderful, and a really wonderful job of focusing us on some of the broader themes and issues to engage our students on, and reminding us that this is not the first ed tech rodeo that we've been on in terms of understanding the implications of this. So, John, talk to us as educators. Let's take an even bigger step back. This is probably a rodeo we're going to be on for a while. And so what are some of the frames that we want to bring to how we think about this and how we think about our role as educators in this work?
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I think it's important to distinguish the ways in which these tools, generative AI, large language models, ChatGPT, both push on familiar pain points that we already face and ways that they generate new problems, new challenges, new opportunities. And I think I'm going to start with some of the familiar pain points that it pushes on. The things that's getting the most hype in terms of broad educational problems are generating college essays and making for game assignments. You have to make sure your assignments aren't gameable by these tools. But these are not new problems. There's already massive inequality in access to resources for infrastructure to write better college essays, to do better on the GREs. Gameable assignments are already a problem for teachers that have too many classes with too many students. So these are familiar pain points. Students, I know this for a fact, there are students that can pay for custom essays. So they already have had access to a better sometimes a better large language model than ChatGPT. And I think the lesson for us in education for thinking about these traditional pain points that is just additionally pushed on by large language models is that we shouldn't look for technical solutions that are really oriented around generative AI. Instead, we have to look at the full range of solutions we already need to apply to solve these problems. Some of those are going to be social, and I don't just mean institutional ones like reducing class sizes, coming up with different ways to evaluate the authenticity of student assignments, but as Kelly mentioned, bringing students into our pedagogical practice. Cover your ears, deans and up. Great, education is not just a credentialing tool, so making clear to students what the value of the things they're learning in your class is, developing assignments that they can clearly see why it's valuable that they put the effort into solving the assignment rather than getting the answer, showing the payoff, what the payoff is going to be for them in their lives, not just in getting their diploma. So these are things that thoughtful teachers, people on this panel, they already did all the work of saying the ways they do these things in their classrooms. So I think those are social solutions that don't involve the technology. There are going to have to be pedagogical solutions too, but we've been working on those too. So flipped classroom models we know give us an opportunity to observe students working in the classroom and evaluate them in a different way. So we have lots of tools that are not technical tools for thinking about the ways that ChatGPT and these tools interact with education in familiar ways. But I will say that like every other sector, there are going to be ethical issues for which we're not prepared for. They're new. How to even think about issues of plagiarism and incorporating ChatGPT outputs into writing and citing those things. Those are all novel challenges. They're specific to the kind of tool. And here I want to make a point that I make about every ethical space in this domain, which is that in every other area where we manage ethical issues in even a moderately decent way, we have a robust ethics ecosystem. A bunch of subcomponents that distribute the work of solving these problems. We teach frontline workers the sort of checklist things they need to do to make sure they're doing the right kind of thing, and know when to reach out to someone with interdisciplinary expertise to help solve them. We have regulations, we have oversight, we have education that gets people so that they understand the sort of underlying systems that they're working in so they can recognize challenges. In the AI space, we have, at best, dog fooding. Like, we really have nothing, and we need to develop that. And you know, Northeastern, we're doing a lot of things to help develop that ecosystem, but I think part of the problem is ecosystemic. There's not sort of one thing we know about today that's going to help us resolve the novel problems that arise in education. We really need to contribute to that ecosystem and think about what that ecosystem looks like in the educational space.
That's terrific. Thank you. We now have time for a few questions. So I want to turn it over to you all. We've got one in the back and also online to ask a few questions of this great panel.
Yeah, we have a few questions online, so I'm going to kick it off with an online question, just so we're fair. This comes from Dave Thurman, the dean of our regional campus in Seattle. I appreciate hearing Kelly's approach to incorporating the technology into her writing classroom. How do the students respond? Do they appreciate learning the risks of relying too greatly on technology?
That's interesting. So I think in terms of the framing, maybe not so much learning the risks of too much technology, because that's a language they speak already, right? Like these are warnings they've been hearing since practically birth about the ways that technology is impacting their ability to engage with the world. But I do think that the students really get, it was surprising to me to learn the ways that they were using ChatGPT, for instance. So we had this conversation, the students were sort of initially like, some of them had never heard of it, which I was surprised. Some of them were already using it in really interesting ways, like planning their schedule, or talking to it in order to figure out, like, ask prompts and that kind of thing. So to learn things in their computer science classes or whatever it might be. So they were already engaging with it in those ways. And they really appreciated, I think, more the opportunity to think through what those limitations might be. And the way, I like that image earlier of the having the human in the loop, right? Like, what are the ways that I can actively engage with this tool, and how can that tool impact what it is that I'm doing, and what is my role in relationship to this as it evolves?
Thank you.
We have a question in the back.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zaff, and I'm a co-op coordinator in CSSH. And I've been working with Vance and trying to create co-op jobs for students in this space. And it's been challenging for students. It's very interdisciplinary, and thinking about coding and studying ethics and philosophy, this interdisciplinary approach, we definitely have a lot of students interested in this space, but challenging in moving and putting students in this actual space for their co-ops. I wonder if anyone had comments on how we might move forward in this experiential learning piece that's so important to our students.
Dan, you want to take that one?
Sure. So for starters, the good and bad is that the firms who are sitting on the other end of the table of the conversation for co-ops also don't know, right? And so, but therein lies the opportunity for us to come to them with recommendations for how they, as firms, can think about this time, and how students, especially students who have been exposed to these capabilities in the context of their coursework, can add real value to those firms. Last week I was at a CEO forum for folks in the construction industry, and they're all wrestling with the same question. How do we think about this in the context of our firms? Our students actually offer a real opportunity for firms to up-level their understanding because of the learning by doing that we do here. So in fact, I would argue that the opportunity is for us to actually instruct our colleagues on the other end of the table for what a co-op could do for you in this context. You don't have this position yet. You don't know that you need it, but we know that you need it. Let's help you co-create this, which at the same time will create the opportunities for our students. The industry needs our help. They aren't sure what to do in this context either, and herein lies an opportunity for us to contribute positively to the conversation. So I would actually suggest we turn that conversation around and go to them with proposals for what we would think will be valuable to them in the context of student co-ops.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think this speaks to the point about we're in a spot where we don't have the kind of ecosystem that would let us say, like, here's an ethics of AI specialist, and that you plug them into this role and they know exactly what to do with that. And we need to convince companies that we're in a spot where they're just going to have to bring in interdisciplinary expertise and learn how to incorporate them and we're all have to learn a new language to speak with one another. And so we have to get them on board with that challenge that we don't have the sort of plug and play employee, because that doesn't exist. And they're going to have to build their own little infrastructure, and that's the sort of first step to doing that.
So quickly to add, since Michelle and I have been working together on this, that one of the challenges connects just to what John just said about the interdisciplinary nature of the team that's required, because we have excellent students who may be philosophy majors, let's say, just to choose a discipline at random, and who are not confident about their coding skills, and so they worry that, well, why would a tech company take me on as part of their ethics group or policy group if I don't know very much about coding or don't have that experience. And so it's important for that corporation, that group, to understand, well, it's true, maybe you don't have coding experience, but you bring other important things that we need and that we don't have.
That's terrific.
Not to mention that it's not only the tech firms that need this help, right? I mean, the marketing firm across the street, or the bookseller down the street, or the manufacturer, not just the tech firms, need an understanding, an interdisciplinary understanding, the type that our students can in fact provide in this area.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, we don't really have time for it, and I have, but we're going to do it. We have a bunch of questions that are coming in online, so I want to make sure they're represented. So I'm actually going to combine two of them, and there are some other questions that are coming up that I also think would be good for the next panel, so I'm going to save those. So don't be offended to our online audience. What would be the best approach to learning about these new technologies using generative AI as there's fast-moving phenomenon? So this is someone who wants to know, where can I get the best, most up-to-date information, as there's a lot of diverse information out there? And there's a follow-up question that says, should we still be using textbooks going forward? And so, they're kind of related to my mind, just thoughts on where you should be getting the information and how quickly will it be changing.
You look like you want to jump in. Go, John.
Vance and I have been collecting a set of primers on large language models that we've tried to find things that are a little more substantive than the sort of hype YouTube videos, but actually explain some of the details that can be useful for thinking about how to integrate in your teaching and where the pitfalls are. We can maybe just share those and we can put those online.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Vance, were you going to add something?
I was going to say what John just said.
Okay, cool.
That's amazing. So go to the Institute for Experiential AI website. We'll put some of those resources on there for people to see.
That's great. So please join me in giving that panel a great round of applause. Thank you so much. That was excellent. And now I have the pleasure of turning it over to Usama for the final panel. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks.
You heard some panels about how we're using this technology in the classroom and what does it mean to education. You heard the first panel about where the jobs are heading and what do we need to do kind of for the future of work. One of the questions that was asked here is most relevant to this panel, which is, well, how do you go about, if you're an organization, an employer, a company, and you want to use this technology, how do you use it? Well, first of all, and what are the dangers, what are the risks, what are the threats, what are the opportunities? That's what we'll be discussing on this panel. But I wanted to start out by saying a couple of words. This is the Institute for Experiential AI. Experiential AI is our code word for AI with the human in the loop. There's a very good reason for why the human is in the loop. You heard about the hallucinations, you heard about other things. I'm gonna refer to a nice statement that my colleague Ken Church came up with the other day. Last Friday, we did a webinar together. And he basically said, we often confuse intelligence with eloquence and fluency. And a lot of what you see with ChatGPT, the reason it puts out so many words has to do with hiding, like appearing intelligent, right, through eloquence and nice fluency, but hiding a lot of the problems. And the problems are deep. Our president, Joseph Aoun, wrote a book called Robot Proof a few years back. And I say Robot Proof is more relevant today than it ever was before. So those are the topics we'll be discussing on today's panel. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as I ask them questions to save on time. Let me start with Yakov Bart. Why is it so important to start preparing our students for using generative AI today, rather than waiting to see first how companies will be actually using it and then start teaching them?
Man, that's a great question. Thank you, Usama. we've seen a lot of technologies, came around in the last couple decades. And often companies could take some sweet time to...
And Jakob, maybe introduce yourself. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Of course. I'm Jakob Bart, marketing professor at the Moore McKim School of Business, core faculty at the Institute for Experiential AI, and faculty leader data initiative at the Moore McKim. So coming to the question, again, why is it different, right? We've seen so many new technologies, so many data analytics tools being introduced in industry in the last 2 decades. How is it different? And the key difference here is speed, right? You look, for example, at the mobile introduction. Facebook could have easily lost, and they did lose several years by not understanding how important mobile for the business, and then they were able to come back. With something like generative AI, we've seen obviously ChatGPT rising as fast as any technology we've seen, right? Million adoption in the first week, 100 million adoption in the first couple months. So if we're gonna be rolling it out at the same speed like we've done before with previous technologies, it's just not gonna be fast enough. And so because we already see industry incorporating these generative AI tools in so many different areas of business, in marketing, for example, we see generative AI now being used for content personalization, both text and image, content creation. We see a lot of help being given to sales support team that rely on AI to help them doing the job. We see a lot of optimization, both in marketing and supply chains, as well as in sales directions, not fully directed to communication to consumers, but rather in B2B settings. And so we cannot sort of wait to see how competitors going to be adopting this technology, something a lot of companies been doing, because at the end of the day, the companies who are not able to hire people who help them to adopt technology fast enough to outcompete the competitors, going to be outcompeted themselves. And that's one of the big challenges for why it's important to do it fast.
Okay. My next question is to Sam. After you introduce yourself, my question is, you've said that ChatGPT isn't ready for prime time in the life sciences, but that AI will be critical for managing the vast amount of information generated each day in the life sciences. Can you explain why ChatGPT is insufficient and what's needed to realize the potential of AI in the life sciences?
Thanks, Usama. Sam Scarpino, I'm the Director of AI and Life Sciences in the Institute for Experiential AI. I'm also a professor of practice in Bouvet College of Health Sciences, Khoury College of Computer Science, and affiliate faculty in Network Science, the Roux Institute, Global Resilience Institute, and I'm on the external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute and Vermont Complex Systems Center. So very, very Northeastern in terms of the interdisciplinary nature. So why isn't ChatGPT ready for prime time, and what are some of the risks? So I would say there are 3. And the first one is related to the data, right? So on average, we generate around 40 gigabytes of data per person per day on the planet, per person per day. But of course, those are not even nearly evenly distributed, right? Most of those data are predominantly generated, at least in the life sciences, on white Western Europeans, United States, and the UK. And so the data are heavily biased towards a very small slice of humanity, right? So, and all of these data are what's used to power these AI tools, right? So this bias creates an incredible gap, both in terms of opportunity and knowledge. So that's the first. The second, and this is related, is that the volume of information is so overwhelming that no human or set of humans could keep up with it. If we think about the number of papers published on COVID-19, you would have had to read a paper every 5-ish minutes without stopping for the past 3 years. No lunch, no bathroom breaks, no television, every 5 minutes to keep up with that information. And for things like CRISPR, right, the gene editing tool that we've seen across the front page of the news, over the past 3 years, you would have had about 15 minutes per paper. And this is sort of standard for the life sciences. So for the first challenge and opportunity, data, overwhelming, humans can't keep up with it, but also overwhelmingly biased, and it's something that we have to engage with. The second is around, and this is a simple one, its inability to cite its sources, right? So ChatGPT and most of these large language models, by design, some of it is because OpenAI probably doesn't want us to know how much intellectual property it's incorporated into its language models without paying for it. But it also, by design, can't actually tell you where it got the information from, right? And so that's fundamentally unacademic, that's fundamentally unreproducible, and that's fundamentally the kind of thing that doesn't allow for innovation inside of spaces like the life sciences. And again, neither one of these, data volume and bias, inability to cite sources, are problems for the life sciences. These are problems across sectors, also in the education space, government, regulation, et cetera. And the third, and this is one that's come to the forefront relatively quickly, although this was actually something that our Senior Vice Provost for Research, David Leslie, asked me the first time I talked with him about OpenAI is, okay, let's say you use ChatGPT to do some fine-tuning. We heard a little bit about fine-tuning, which is you take some of your own documents and you tune some of the parameters associated with the large language models. Where does all of that intellectual property, where does all that data go? Well, it goes straight to OpenAI, it goes straight to these private companies in terms of their ability to use that in a derivative way. And it's one of the reasons why it's so critical that we engage as a university on the public good side of these, because they are an incredible public good. They're also hopefully biased, hopelessly biased. They're hopefully biased in some ways. They're hopelessly biased. And they are effectively locking all of us out of any benefit sharing with respect to the downstream derivative products that come off of this. And so those are the opportunities that we have in the life sciences, but they're also much broader than that, of course.
Thanks, Sam. And that emphasizes the point around data. In Byron's wonderful compressed introduction to the field, he talked about how data was fed into it. But what is not talked about a lot is how much money was spent. And we're talking about numbers in the billions here on curating that data that trained ChatGPT. They did not feed it the entire internet. In fact, they spent over a year just selecting which data sets to feed it so that it kind of minimizes the biases. It is still biased. To Jansu, please introduce yourself and tell us, how should companies think about the risks and opportunities posted by generative AI use? What should be their strategy for an ethical approach to implementation?
So I'm Jansu Janja. I'm the AI ethics lead at the Institute for Experiential AI. I design and co-lead the responsible AI practice and research, and I'm a research associate professor at the philosophy department. I'm a philosopher by training. So I think I have two main thoughts now after two panels. The main thing I think is to realize that the questions about how to integrate ethics into the innovation cycle, into private sector, into companies, organizations, is not so specific about the generative AI. We need to think about these questions as we develop AI systems, develop, deploy, design AI systems. The idea that, specifically about the generative AI case, the risks are not clear. We don't know how the system is. We know some of the ways that the system fails, but we don't know all the ways that the system can fail. So, of course, it becomes very clear that we need to create structures within companies and within academia, within research, of sandboxing, trying different approaches. And we talk about human in the loop, but what does it mean to have human in the loop? Exactly where should be the human? What should the human look for? And how do we make sure that the human understands what's going on and interjects at the right time, doing the right thing? Another thing I think is interesting and came up with all of these open letters about generative AI and so on is that how do we differentiate the different risks that occur at different stages of AI development and deployment? What does it mean to have a privacy risk at the research phase versus a privacy risk at the deployment phase? How can we approach these different risks effectively, which means differently? We cannot just block everything and try to overlay an ethics on top of it. And tying this to the earlier panels. So Professor Winslow mentioned the AI systems that are used in healthcare and that are about the patient admission, patient discharge, questions related how human health practitioners should make decisions using the AI systems. And I think we have to recognize that the ethical questions that go into the design of these systems are not like AI ethics, like the super novel AI ethics. It comes from population level bioethics that we've been dealing with for many years. It comes from the medical ethics discussions, and integrating this with the novel questions that AI is posing, again, from the moment of development, how we are dealing with the algorithms, how we are dealing with the data, but all the way to the user interface design. So when you think about interdisciplinary collaboration, as a philosopher, I'm going to say philosophy is at the core of AI ethics, because you can't do ethics without philosophy. But we have to have this tightly collaborated with the computer science as well as design because of the user interface aspect. And the last thing that I just want to say is that education, if we are thinking about how the companies are, how companies should think about customer-facing use of generative AI, it's also interesting that as an educational institution, how are we using the customer-facing, how are we using generative AI in a customer-facing way? So how do we allow our students engage with AI? And here I'm a little, I don't know, again, being a Kant researcher, I'm a little worried when Kant and Bentham has a conversation because I wonder, do we know how to safeguard around the conversation? There's a huge difference between the demeanor of Kant versus the arguments that Kant makes, and that has real implications in public health policy, for example. So what do students really learn? How do we sandbox and understand the risks? Maybe as or before we put the generative AI in our classroom. And I think I spoke too long already.
That's all right. So we'll speed up our answers, hopefully. David, again, introduce yourself and tell us, we see a lot of stories about language models hallucinating or making up facts. Why does this happen, and how can we mitigate these weaknesses when we use it?
Right. I'm David Smith. I'm an associate professor in the Khoury College of Computer Sciences and a founding member of the new Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks, Northeastern's Faculty Research Center for the Digital Humanities and Computational Social Sciences. And, the examples of hallucination are things like I was at a kid's birthday party this weekend, and then another dad there was saying, yeah, I was making up a career for me and said that, I had died in 2013. Sort of putting an end to my biography. Or talking to another colleague who said, well, it decided that I should be married rather than divorced because, it made a better story. And this is something you hinted at in your introduction, Usama, right, that these large language models are eloquent, or as I might put them, they are rhetorical machines, right? Whether it's, getting the genre of, King James narrative that Byron opened this session with, or the genre of, common period for regulation that Professor Novak talked about, or other legal genres, other teaching genres that the people teaching writing mentioned in the previous panel, right? These are fundamentally rhetorical machines, right, that can, do the police voices, as T.S. Eliot would say, or talk in different genres. And, okay, I'm not a philosopher, unlike so many of my learned colleagues here, but, I think it's fair to say that some philosophers and mathematicians going back thousands of years have been suspicious of rhetoric and eloquence, right? That it keeps you, it gets in the way of producing new knowledge. And yet, but we don't have to believe everything Plato says. Plato didn't like democracy either, right? And eloquence and rhetoric have uses. The ability to help students talk in these new voices, as people on the previous panel talked about in their own teaching. And so having these rhetorical machines hooked up to all of the other data curation and algorithmic methods that Professor Winslow, for instance, talked about, is where a lot of the opportunities for applying these technologies will lie.
Thank you. And now I'm going to ask our panelists to go in rapid mode for answers so we can get through them and get to some questions. Yakov, does Northeastern University have a good record in applying the experiential learning approach to get students ready for careers in digitally transformed businesses, involving new technologies at data science, and how we could leverage what we've learned in doing the experiential learning around generative AI today?
Well, the very short answer is yes, but if you give me a minute to elaborate. Indeed, we have a lot of successes in creating experiential learning opportunities for students. And as my colleagues on the previous panel mentioned, the industry also recognizes they really need to understand what they're going to do with generative AI. So we have vehicles for these collaborations. For example, in Demore McKim, we created Data Initiative Research Practicum, where companies can come in and work with student teams that help them to solve some real-world business challenges, connect with senior leadership who give feedback on the problems they solve, and of course, it also helps companies to create early talent pipeline as well. And so when we're talking about generative AI, we already see a lot of companies really interested in building projects around helping with sales, around helping with personalized advertising. We're already talking to some clients getting ready for fall semester. And what's really important and what I think we can do in this experiential learning when we work both with industry and with students, and to have our students to recognize not just what generative AI can, but also what it cannot do. And not just from ethical perspective, but also just from pure business perspective. Because we see, for example, when students start understanding where generative AI comes from, how it works, it helps them understand that, for example, in some settings like sales support is more effective. In another setting, like beating the market, getting better in investment, it may not be as effective because the data is limited, it's noisy, it changes quickly, etc. And so I think by bringing together industry perspective and perspective of faculty doing research in these areas, it really prepares students for careers. And it's important for companies to get the students that we train, because otherwise, again, as I mentioned, they're going to be outcompeted.
And we'll talk about that in our announcements. Sam, how can a university partner like Northeastern help organizations leverage generative AI and mitigate the risks associated with IP leakage, which we haven't talked much about here? Can you provide specific examples of ongoing work on this?
So as I mentioned, one of the biggest risks associated with using these large language models is that you have to hand over your intellectual property to a small number of private companies. And that's one of the critical roles that a university can and must play as a public good and an educational resource, is to provide opportunities for organizations to use tools like large language models in such a way that it protects not just the intellectual property, but the downstream opportunities that may arise off of those data. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the biggest challenges associated with these models are data bias. A big problem with reducing data bias is that maybe individuals represented in these data sets will have had their privacy violated in some way. They will have had invasive procedures performed on them, and they will be locked out of the potential monetization or at least any downstream benefits of these data. And that's a critical role for a university, and it's one of the things that we're embracing at Northeastern. Just very quickly, a project that Professor Winslow runs out of the Roux Institute is associated with this Maine Cancer Genomics Board. And one of the things that they do is for individuals with particularly challenging cancers, they sequence the genome of the tumor, and then a board of physicians sits around the table with medical literature and tries to diagnose what treatment opportunities there may be for these individuals. This has been an incredible resource for an incredibly small number of people because it doesn't scale. And one of the things that Professor Winslow and the team at Roux Institute are doing is trying to bring AI together with physicians in the loop and patients in the loop to scale this outside of Maine and globally. But figuring out how we do this in such a way that all of that intellectual property and all of those patient privacy, the aspects of patient privacy are protected is critical, and it's the kind of thing that a university can bring to the table and that Northeastern is bringing.
Thanks. Very quickly, Jansu, the question of using AI responsibly and ethically, especially in the context of these large language models doing information fusion, where you lose track of where stuff came from and it gets fused together, etc. What are the issues that an organization that wants to use the technologies have to think about, and how to do this responsibly?
Yeah, I'm again going to take it a little bit outside of the generative AI specific, but back to the novel technologies question. So if you think about putting in a responsible AI framework effectively, you need to think about it in different layers, basically. So there's this question of how do you, when you are using, let's say, the generative AI for a particular customer-facing goal, how do we analyze the details? How do we analyze the ethical issues that may arise? And again, how do we figure out what are the safeguards? What can we do to mitigate either on the development side or in the design aspect of it, or by bringing in the human at the right time in the right place? So how can we make sure a single product or project is properly developed and deployed? But beyond that, we don't want to do this every time from scratch. So we want to put in place strategies for organizations to have their guidelines, their principles, but operationalized, not just like lofty ideals. Having these guidelines, having these tools integrated into workflow without creating bottlenecks, without making ethics as something that stops innovation, but is there to help enhance innovation, and not just in the saying, but really making it usable. And the other thing is, of course, making sure that people are skilled in the organization to be able to do that. And I think this also goes back to what John was talking about in the ethics ecosystem aspect. We need to have people who have different capabilities in ethics within organizations. It's not just put in an ethics board or have a chief of ethics officer there and let everything to be decided by those people. But no, we want to make sure that people like us are, like organizations like Northeastern, we are training people to be experts in ethics for the expert positions, but then also literacy in ethics, and the ability to be what we call the ethics respondents within the system, so that within the organization, so that you have sort of like a pyramid structure where you can escalate the ethics question more efficiently.
Okay. Last question is going to go to David. Maybe help us summarize, what can we do now that wasn't possible before? And how can universities fill in the gaps in our knowledge so we can effectively use the new technology?
Yeah, I think a lot of the panelists have made the very eloquent case for the fundamental role that the university could play. So I'll add one more, which is that a lot of thinking around new technologies is centered around how we can use the data available to us, whether it's publicly available, that we've talked about on several panels, or whether it's private data that a particular company may have, or that may be private to an individual. And if you take computer science classes, human-computer interaction, visualization, statistics, all these courses that help you make sense of data, you learn different techniques, building models, building visualizations, trying to build explanations for mechanistic systems for why the world works the way it does. But there's something that generative AI provides that hasn't been available before, which is the automation of narrative, telling stories about the data, about both the data that we have and counterfactually stories about the future, data that don't exist yet, right? How may things go? Or what's in that gap where we don't have any data, whether it's because it's outside the Western world that's very well observed in the data sets that we have, and all of the pitfalls that come from extrapolation. But still, right, we want to responsibly draw inferences and tell stories about the questions that we have, the questions that our students have. And since stories are the way that most people get their information about the world in general, going back thousands of years, having a technology to do that well will be transformative.
So in wrap up, and we want to take a couple of questions maybe, I'm going to ask the panelists in one sentence only, each of you starting with Sam, what's the major thought you would like to leave with our audience after today's multiple panels?
I want to ask ChatGPT to write me a very long sentence, but no. So we sat down with the head of AI at a big pharmaceutical company, and they were interested in 4 things: upskilling, talent, sponsored research at the proof of concept, and evaluating potential opportunities with respect to vendors and AI models. Northeastern has all of those in spades, right? And so Northeastern is the place where people should be engaging with these challenges. And I think that's one of the things we've seen throughout the day today.
That was a long sentence. Jakob.
I'll try to keep it shorter. The message for external stakeholders certainly figure out how to bring in trained people to help you competing with other businesses faster than other businesses figure out how to put you out of business with their AI applications.
I completely agree. In addition to that, I think the one thing is to be careful about we are talking about the generative AI. We should, like anything like the utopian or dystopian hype, I think is just not a good way of thinking about these questions. We really need to think about the ethical questions, responsible AI, in a structured, analytical manner where we identify the issues and find solutions for them. Words matter. I don't know why we are calling these AI hallucinations, but that is a weird term to use if we are trying to make sure that AI is not human-like. And we need to work on this in a multidisciplinary manner, but also division of labor matters. We cannot be experts in everything, but we need to be experts in our own areas, and we need to learn how to collaborate effectively, efficiently.
I counted 4 sentences. David.
Right. To be concrete, artificial intelligence is an archival science, the science of curating and understanding and extrapolating from the data that we have.
Liz, any questions?
An online question, and then I already saw someone raise his hand over there who I didn't get to last time, so I'll be sure to make it over there as well. So this question is, since AI depends on existing information/data to create new data, what's going to happen when there is more AI-generated information/data than human-generated ones, and AI will depend on AI-generated info data with all of its issues?
Who wants to take a brief answer?
The brief answer, right. We have the opportunity to benefit from this abundance and create new culture. Right? We use technology as a way for creating new culture. And whether that culture overwhelms us and causes social change, I think I'm with the previous panelists that I'm not going to make a prediction. But we know that we need to develop social structures to deal with those social changes.
Great. And we have one other question over here.
Hi, so I was wondering what you guys think of the institution of the use of brain activity with blood flow in the brain. There's a new study about MRIs and actually doing brain activity to concept generation, where essentially from brain blood flow, we can now directly interpret thoughts into tangible ideas and art and things like that. And I was wondering if you guys think that that is actually how it could be used, or if it's too dangerous even, because we're almost reading the mind at this point.
I'll answer briefly. So I think that technology is a ways away from what you were painting. That is certainly the direction that people are pushing things, and we have a lot of experts at Northeastern that work on this. One thing that I will say that we're doing at the Institute for Experiential AI and the Network Science Institute is trying to feed back our understanding of how we mathematize the brain onto AI systems. So if you look at a neural network, it actually doesn't look much at all like a brain, and that's part of the reason why it takes forests and forests and forests of carbon to train a neural net and a few sandwiches to train a brain. And so that is one of the things that we are working on, is how we feed back this improved mathematical understanding onto the AI systems.
I'll also just say concretely, I don't want to go without highlighting the work of my colleague Denis Ardamos in electrical engineering, who I've collaborated with a little bit on brain-computer interfaces to help locked-in patients with ALS and other conditions actually type even without motor control, just by using brain activity non-invasively. Right, not by putting electrodes in the brain, and so that's an application of language modeling for helping predictive typing for those kinds of users.
Please join me in thanking our panel. For those of you online, any questions submitted, we are going to follow up with answers online, so be sure to submit. We'll take 5 more minutes of your time to kind of give some concluding remarks and make a few announcements on how Northeastern is kind of responding and rising to the challenge and what we're doing about it. So we heard a lot of stuff today. And the confusion, you know, I've attended way too many panels and talks and all of this over the last 3 months on ChatGPT, so I'm overloaded. And what I get from it is kind of very little understanding of what's going on. There's a lot of confusion. One reminder I'd like to make, I love the term stochastic parrots. These things are saying stuff that they don't understand, which means if you're about to go and start using the technology, you have to think about how does a system that's incapable of understanding what it's saying and reasoning about it, not even common sense reasoning, function? Well, it won't function unless you have that human intervention there. What Ray Winslow referred to as kind of the recommendations. It's just another input. How to know when to discard of that input or when to accept it, when to pay attention to it and maybe do more research, how to adjust the output is a big deal. So we're going to make 3 announcements today, and I'm going to call on a couple of colleagues to talk about the announcements. The first one, I can't read here, so I'll read there. But the first one is about how to learn this stuff, right? So one of the biggest problems, you know, we didn't talk here much about the role of data and how important it is. Data science is essential with machine learning to get AI to work, at least the AI of today. The AI of today that doesn't reason, that doesn't understand, but can do very smart and sometimes timely predictions, and often will do weird stuff. So how to make it work is a very hard thing. We train students typically in a university in classroom knowledge, and when they graduate with knowledge of data science or of AI, what they're lacking is a knowledge of how that stuff is used in the real world. I always draw the analogy of the teaching hospital. You go to medical school, you learn all sorts of amazing stuff. Then you get thrown for a residency in a hospital where you quickly realize, hey, 80% of what I do day to day in a hospital, managing beds and patients and dealing with nurses, has nothing to do with what I learned in the classroom, right? That part applies big time to data science and AI. We have created an AI solutions hub where we work with partner companies and organizations on actually solving problems. So we formulate a problem, we solve it, and in the solving of that problem, we actually create a learning experience, both for a new kind of co-op that we created that says, do your co-op at the Institute for Experiential AI while working on companies' data and involving the company's employees. One of my favorite examples here is the case study that we did with Sun Life, which is a large Canadian insurance company, where not only did we identify the list of opportunities and problems they have, we worked with them to prioritize which one gets solved. We created a class run by Dan Kolosky and his team to actually execute in parallel to the solutioning and see what happens with real data and the real challenges. And what was the biggest surprise is Sun Life stepped up and said, actually, I want some of my actuaries to attend this class as students because I want to demystify what data science and AI is. And indeed, we actually got to observe not just an amazing result in terms of the output, but also the fact that these actuaries entered the course saying, I don't understand how this unstructured data is going to fit into my spreadsheets, to within 3 months saying, oh my God, this is so simple, right? There are algorithms out there and libraries that extract structure from unstructured data, and then I can use that the structured attributes in my Excel models and make predictions on the future. So announcement number 1 is, we are ready to engage with you on projects, solve your problems, as a company or organization, and in that solutioning, engage co-ops and students so that you can get to observe how these students perform on your data, on your problems, hopefully along with some of your employees that we help you upskill. The second announcement, I want to draw on Mike Bennett, Jansu, to come up and tell us. And then Mike.
I think all that referral to how to put ethics into action, how to engage with the companies and make sure that ethics is a part of their innovation process, well, that's what we are trying to do with the responsible AI practice at the Institute. The mindset is that responsible AI enhances technology. So we are not there to sort of like be the policers or create bottlenecks for the companies, but what we want to do is to make sure that we can integrate ethics in an efficient manner into the organizational structure and the innovation workflow. The responsible AI practice at Northeastern is a very unique practice because we are really bridging academia and industry. We are not trying to dumb down the ethical questions, make it simple, make it like the bite size. We are trying to make sure that whatever we put in place are robust in the philosophical background, in the computer science background, in the design background, so that we can confidently say that we are giving something of value to the companies. And also, I think it's important to understand and know that responsible AI does not have existing standards, rules, and so on. So a lot of research goes into our engagement with the organization. So we do the research as we build these tools, as we build these guidelines, which makes it very important that there is that we are situated in Northeastern, that there are these colleagues, that we have these colleagues who are working on the foundational aspects of the questions, be it the philosophical questions, be it the computer science questions, that we can then build on. So we have multiple aspects of our framework. We have a framework for responsible AI, which has the strategy aspect, the governance aspect, where we build tools and guidelines for companies. We have, as I said, the analysis, product and project analysis, and the training. Again, we collaborate with, exactly in the slide. We collaborate with different different institutes within the university to work on these in-company trainings or in university trainings. And what we want to make sure that happens is that all this talk that did happen in the last 5 years about AI ethics principles and responsible AI is not just aspirations, but we operationalize them, turn them into tools that different levels of people in the organization can use. And I think the last thing is that we do provide a unique opportunity for students and researchers because we are providing them. There was a question about the co-op, for example, related to that, but also, for example, we are putting embedded ethicists into companies, into actual, private companies that are in this loss of how do we proceed? We don't have the talent. Well, we help them have the talent, embed it in the right way. So we do provide the researchers and students the opportunity to work at the intersection of academia and industry. That's all from me.
Mike Bennett. And then Miklos, did you want to say a couple words?
Thank you, Usama. So as everyone that's made it through this event today probably very clearly understands, right now education will need to be an essential element of our finding our way through this age of AI. And fortunately for everyone, the Institute is well aware of this, and we've been working to spin up courses to do just that. The announcement is very simply articulated. By the time we get to the heart of summer this year, we'll have 3 courses that are ready to go, that are designed for 3 distinct audiences and for 3 different purposes, really. So the first one, AI and Law, is exactly what it sounds like. The introduction of generative AI is already sending very intense ripples through practice, certainly across the Anglo-American space, but also across Asia and Africa as well. And so we are prepared to launch a course that addresses these issues. Case study-based training here that is intended to effectively upskill practitioners. The expectation that it will be primarily American lawyers, but it'll be suitable for folks in the UK, in the EU, and in other parts of the world as well. The second course is much more recognizable as an upskilling course. So effectively a course that is intended to help businesses understand the nitty-gritty of what it takes to incorporate and implement generative AI and other AI techniques within their businesses such that they have a better chance of more efficiently hitting their goals and achieving their missions. A little bit longer in terms of duration than the first course, but with a similar goal. Again, helping to onboard so that professionals and employees are able to augment their capacities with AI. And then lastly, going relatively wide in comparison to the first two courses, a course that we're calling Introduction to AI, effectively a MOOC designed to help learners at scale, hundreds of thousands, ideally. Perhaps it'll take a moment to get to that number, but wide open. It'll be a free course as well. And there'll be no prerequisites for this one. So imagine a course that is designed to satisfy the urge and the impulse of learners around the world who are curious about AI, interested, perhaps even a little worried and excited by it. This will be the course for them. And so these are the three courses.
Thank you, Mike. Miklos, a couple of words on the AI Solutions Hub. Miklos is based in Portland, Maine, at the Roux Institute, where we are building the big AI Solutions Hub.
Thank you, Usama. So one of the founding principles of the Institute for Experiential AI is the ability to ground our work in real-world problems. And one of our engines for that is the AI Solutions Hub. Originally, it was called the AI Solutions Factory. I think it was President Aoun who suggested we change it to the Hub. And I think the Hub is a very apt name because its value to our industry partners lies in our ability to integrate an educational element, to integrate the faculty element, to provide the core value of Northeastern in a way that allows companies to receive a solution that, yes, drives ROI for them, but really connects them to the forefront of artificial intelligence in a way that is not only productive, but responsible. And the AI Solutions Hub is a group of full-time professional data scientists, data engineers who are working on our partner problems around the clock. Together with our faculty and students, they provide this key method of outreach to our industry partners.
Thank you, Miklos. And with that, nope, not advancing anymore. Okay. With that, I just wanted to wrap up by thanking you for attending. The experiential education, our engagement through the AI Solutions Hub, our engagement with the responsible AI practice on real problems, real issues, and like real thorny issues with some of the big financial services firms and others are all consistent with Northeastern University's academic plan, which is the term we give to our strategic 5 and 10-year plans, where the main theme is we go out in the world, we engage on real problems, and then we take back the learnings to the classroom so that we can prepare our learners and our students for a more relevant job experience when they're ready to go out there and do the jobs of tomorrow. So thank you for attending. Hopefully this was a useful event, and stay tuned, get in touch. We're ready to engage with you and help. Thank you.